Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to add sashing to a quilt. I'm going to be using these string blocks that I made in a previous video. I'll share a link at the end of this video if you want to make string blocks. So let's get started. First, take all of your blocks and trim them down to make sure they're all exactly the same size. I'm making these 12 inches by 12 inches. If you're using the string blocks like me, it's easy to find the centre because you've joined four together, so you've got a horizontal line and a vertical line, and you can match those up with the centre of your ruler to make sure you get a nice even square when you cut them. Cut all of the blocks you are going to be using down to the size that you'd like. Like I said, I'm doing mine 12 inches, but you can use whatever size you like. Next, cut strips of fabric for the sashing. My strips are 1.5 inches wide. So that's one inch for the sashing and then 1/2 inch for 2/4 inch seams. But you could make these strips wider or possibly narrower if you wanted. For my quilt I needed to cut 7 strips, but it does depend upon the size of your quilt. I cut 12 12-inch strips and 3 strips that I left at the full length of 44 inches, which is the size of my fabric, and these 3 are the ones that separated the rows. Next, lay all of your blocks out in the order that you would like them to be in for your quilt. I have 16 squares, so that's 4 by 4, and pile them up in their rows in the correct order, one on top of the other, keeping all of your rows together. Once you've decided which order you want them to go in, keep them in their rows, and then I write row 1, row 2, row 3 and row 4 on the piles so I don't get mixed up later. Now the first thing you need to do is join all of the columns to form the top row, and then you'll form all of the columns to make the second row. So these are all the columns of the first row that I'm pointing out here, and they're what we're going to sew together first, and then when we've done those we'll join all of the second row and all of the third row, followed by all of the fourth row. Now take the top block from the first row, then with right sides together place your first piece of sashing on your first block and pin it to the right hand side of that first block. Then at your sewing machine, sew your first strip of sashing in place, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then line up with your second block. So open out your sashing and then take the first piece and fold it over the second piece, so you've got the right side of your sashing facing the right side of your second block. Line it up and pin in place or clip in place. Then at your sewing machine, join your second block to the sashing, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Continue joining your blocks together in this way until you've finished your first row. In my case, that's when I've joined 4 blocks together. Press your seams towards the sashing. The first thing I do is to set the seam. So I just press gently all the way down the first seam, and then I fold my blocks back over, finger press, and then press on the seam. And then I'll do exactly the same on the other side. So once that first seam is pressed, you can go on to the seam on the other side of that sash. So again, I start by setting the seam by just gently pressing all the way down, and then press the other side of the sashing. Once you've finished your first row, do exactly the same with your second, third and fourth rows, or however many rows you happen to have. Join them in exactly the same way. Remembering as you finish each row to put your number with the row so you know which number row it is. Then open out your first row and take one of your long strips of sashing that you cut and place it with right sides together on the bottom edge of your first row. I'm kind of working upside down here. but this is the bottom edge. The top edge is facing me. And pin or clip the sashing to your first row. Then sew the sashing to your blocks, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The next step is a little bit more tricky. You're going to need to line up your sashing on your first row with the sashing on your second row. So to do this, you'll need to make 2 marks on the top of your sashing across the top of your rows. So find your sashing that's going vertically, and using a ruler line it up so it's nice and straight all the way along with your sashing, and put a mark either side. So when you join your next row, you'll be able to join the sashing up so it should be in line with the first row of sashing. Just check carefully to make sure it's all going to be lined up, and then bring your second row and place it on top of your first row. Then join your second row's sashing to the marks that you put on the horizontal sashing of your first row. And then once you've got it lined up, either pin or clip it in place. Continue matching up your sashing all the way along this row until it's all nicely lined up. If you don't think you've got it quite right, go back and make sure that it is right, because if you've not got it right, you'll have to unpick it and start again, and you really don't want to do that. So try and get it right first time, although that's not always possible. You do sometimes have to unpick it and start again. But before you sew, open it out like I've done, and just make sure that you think they are all going to line up, and then sew together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing your pins or clips as you go along. Now open it up and check that your vertical lines are all matching. So the vertical lines on your first row are matching the ones on your second row. And then you can press your seams towards your sashing. Set the seams first by gently pressing the seam, and then open out and make sure that your seams are going towards the sashing, and press. Finger press first, and then press with a nice hot iron. And continue all the way along the row, making sure that it's all nicely pressed. Carry on adding the rest of your rows, remembering to line up the sashing so that all the lines line up. And you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, could you please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.